Started school at Brown in 2003. I ran out of money and joined the Army in September of 2004. I spent a year in Iraq, in Tal Afar. It was a town just west of Mosul, up in the north, about 200,000 people. And it's an enclave of Turkmen left over from the Ottoman Empire. It's built around an Ottoman fortress. Our deployment was cited by President George Bush on March 20th, 2006 as a model of success. He talked about Tal Afar being a city that gave hope for a free Iraq. And of course, this has been a repeating theme for him every couple of years. We're almost there and have almost won the war. But the fact is that this isn't a winnable war. And the reason for that is because it's really not a war. It's an occupation of a country, and occupations can't be won, they can only be ended. When I was in Tal Afar, one of the things that I was able to do that I wasn't able to do back here, or would never have been able to do back here, is to see for myself the difference between what our deployment was like on the ground and the way the deployment was depicted back here in the media, whether that be in the newspapers or through Bush's speeches or a letter written by the mayor of Tal Afar, which was widely disseminated. There were several ways that things were quite different, and a lot of ways that things can be spun that are not really talked about. I think everyone knows that when you turn on the news now and you see violence, it's always suicide bombers this and suicide bombers that. And I don't deny that that kind of violence may exist. But while I was in Tal Afar, the vast majority of the civilian casualties that I saw were caused by us. There was a time, for instance, when we rolled up in our Bradley and got out, went into the front yard of a house and saw 7 women sprawled out on the ground, blood everywhere. One of them had shrapnel in her head, she died. The other ones were terribly wounded. And so those were people that I had to bandage and carry to the Bradleys and move out. There were a couple of kids there also who were wounded. I did not see the whole time I was there a civilian killed by an insurgent. Now I have to say, I was only there for a year. I was only in one city. So I won't make the claim that my experience is generalizable to the rest of Iraq. Again, spin. There was a CNN series that was done, a few little stories about Tal Afar. They talked about us liberating a hospital in the city. And so what this means is that there were ostensibly 2 tribes that were fighting over the hospital, and the tribe that kind of won wanted us to go there and occupy it. So we stationed Iraqi troops and American troops inside the hospital on the roof at the entrances. And of course, as soon as we got there, people started attacking the hospital because we were there. And as soon as they attacked the hospital, everyone shot out into the neighborhoods. And as soon as they shot out into the neighborhoods, patients started coming in. And so it was one of these absurd and futile missions. And it lasted almost the entire year we were there, to the extent that they kept troops at the hospital. Now, eventually they moved American troops out to a government building about 50 feet away from the hospital so that we were no longer technically violating the Geneva Conventions. But Iraqi Army troops stayed the whole time. But the reason I bring that particular instance up, besides the fact that it was, I think, not particularly ethical, is that it was spun as we liberated a hospital. There are so many examples of this, I can't go into it in a couple minutes I have left to talk, but Another example is humanitarian missions. For instance, in the newsletters that were sent back home, and you might see this from time to time, that the kids in a local neighborhood love the troops. Well, sometimes this is because the troops bring bags of candy with them. This might seem very nice. It's billed as a goodwill gesture to bring candy out with the Bradleys and hand it to the kids or throw it to the kids. We brought football sometimes, gave them MREs. But in effect, and this was of course not official, but it was certainly said behind the scenes, in effect what we were doing was making sure that big crowds of children surrounded our vehicles so that nobody would shoot at us. So it's not exactly coercion. We weren't holding the kids at gunpoint, but I think when you're talking about 7, 8-year-old kids and throwing candy on the ground and making them run to the vehicle, it's a pretty clear use of them as human shields. My experiences may be the exception to the rule. I encourage you to be skeptical. We aren't the ones who need to learn something new necessarily about how bad this war is. But there are a lot of people out there who don't understand how bad it is, or understand it but ignore it, or feel that it's justified because if we leave Iraq, there'll be a power vacuum. Winter Soldier was mentioned. This was an event, as he said, over this past weekend where over 50 Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans got in front of cameras and told their stories like mine, but a lot of them certainly were much worse. These are Marines and Army guys who talked about being on the ground, being ordered by senior commissioned officers to fire at will at anything that moved: men, women, children, dogs, cats. People who talked about participating in brutally beating detainees or Iraqi civilians who had done nothing and were not detained. The stories go on, and they're posted now on the IVAW website. You can go there. These are pretty compelling stories, and I think what they do is they help to humanize the situation over there. To hear people who were involved in very disturbing situations talk about it very honestly and emotionally. Just encourage people to take away from this not a sense that we've accomplished something particularly meaningful other than building a sense of community, but that we all have a responsibility to go out and continue to try to bring people's attention to the nature of this war and the reasons that it's terribly unethical for us to be fighting the terrorists overseas so that we don't have to fight them at home. This is Bush's phrase. Of course, it's been said lots of times. It's kind of I think in some ways, maybe one of the most honest ways to frame what's going on over there. I mean, if you really think about it, fighting the terrorists overseas so that we don't have to fight them at home. And what does that mean? That means we're killing Iraqis so that Americans don't get killed here. It means we're shooting Apache helicopter high explosive rounds into the front yard of some woman's house so that somebody over here perhaps won't get killed. And I think this is related, for instance, to the fact that we know how many Americans have died, and we have no idea how many Iraqis have died. And so this justification for war, fighting the terrorists overseas so we don't have to fight them at home, what to me that is really saying is that Iraqis are not human. They're not as human as we are. They aren't as important as we are.